The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber was unusually still that morning. Cameras rolled quietly as senators shuffled papers, aides whispered last-minute notes, and the hum of anticipation filled the air. Every eye turned toward the central microphone as Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell rose from his seat. At 82, his movements were deliberate, the product of decades spent navigating the corridors of political power. His expression was fixed, part discipline, part disdain, as he adjusted his glasses and began to speak. "Mr. Chairman," McConnell said, his tone cool and steady, "today we consider a nomination that, in my view, represents one of the most extreme choices ever proposed to lead the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division." Across the room, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, composed and silent. Her royal blue suit caught the lights of the C-SPAN cameras that panned across her face. For Crockett, this was more than a confirmation hearing. It was the culmination of a career built on the pursuit of justice and the fight for equal protection under the law. Yet, she knew the moment McConnell rose, this hearing would not be a typical proceeding. It would be a confrontation between two generations, two philosophies, and two visions of America's future. McConnell continued, outlining his objections. He claimed that Crockett's record reflected not the balanced judgment of a legal professional, but the zeal of an activist. Her background, he said, reveals a pattern of divisive rhetoric, a distrust of law enforcement, and a willingness to politicize justice. The Civil Rights Division deserves a steward of fairness, not an advocate for one side of the political aisle. The room was tense. Even some Democratic senators shifted uneasily. The minority leader's words carried weight. He had built his career on precisely this type of opposition. For nearly 20 years, McConnell had been the Senate's master tactician, turning procedural rules into instruments of political warfare. His nickname, the Tortoise, was less an insult than a reflection of his method: slow, deliberate, unyielding. When he chose to block something, it stayed blocked. But this time, McConnell's target was not a judicial nominee or a sweeping piece of legislation. It was Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose rise represented something new. At 42, she was part of a generation of lawmakers who entered politics not through the party machine, but through lived experience and advocacy. A civil rights attorney by training, Crockett had argued voting rights cases across the South, defended families facing housing discrimination, and challenged police misconduct long before she ran for Congress. Her work was praised by civil rights organizations nationwide, but to McConnell and his allies, it symbolized a challenge to the old order he had spent decades preserving. Behind McConnell's rhetoric lay deeper political calculation. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department had always been a flashpoint of ideological struggle. To conservatives, it represented government overreach. To progressives, it was a vital guardian of equality. A strong, reform-minded leader at its helm could mean renewed enforcement of voting rights, greater police accountability, and expanded protections against discrimination. All issues McConnell had resisted for much of his career. Stopping Crockett wasn't just about ideology, it was about control of a powerful institution. As McConnell neared the end of his remarks, he gestured to a thick binder in front of him. "Before my colleagues cast their votes," he said, "I urge them to review the document I've entered into the record, a detailed analysis outlining Representative Crockett's most concerning statements and actions. I am confident that, upon review, even members of the opposite party will agree, this nomination should be withdrawn." He closed his folder, stepped back from the microphone, and returned to his seat with a measured sense of satisfaction. It was the kind of performance he had perfected over years of hearings and floor speeches, a blend of authority, accusation, and control. Chairman Dick Durbin, seated at the center of the dais, adjusted his microphone. "Thank you, Senator McConnell," he said. Turning toward the witness table, he continued, "Representative Crockett, you may now respond to the senator's remarks." All eyes turned to Crockett. She leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. Her face was calm, almost serene. Those who knew her recognized the expression, not one of anger, but of focus. It was the look of a trial lawyer preparing to cross-examine a witness, the composure of someone who had faced tougher adversaries than Mitch McConnell. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began. "And thank you, Senator McConnell, for your remarks and for your concerns regarding my record. I appreciate the opportunity to address them directly." The opening words were simple, but her tone carried authority. She was not defensive. She was not apologetic. McConnell leaned slightly forward, expecting the usual caution nominees adopted, vague reassurances, deferential nods. But Crockett continued firmly. The senator has submitted a 68-page document outlining what he describes as my radical positions. I've reviewed it carefully, and I'd like to respond to its main points. A ripple of surprise moved across the room. Few nominees ever addressed opposition research so directly. Most avoided confrontation, preferring to deflect or soften their answers. But Crockett had prepared differently. She reached into her folder and lifted a document of her own. I've prepared a written response, she said, not to deny that I've taken strong positions on civil rights, but to provide the context missing from the senator's report. The atmosphere shifted. McConnell's plan had been simple: put Crockett on the defensive, frame her as an extremist, and pressure moderate Democrats to reconsider their support. But instead of retreating, she met the challenge head-on. For example, she said, the senator's report cites my criticism of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder as evidence of extremism. What it fails to note is that my position aligns with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent in that case, which warned that striking down key protections of the Voting Rights Act was, quote, like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Several senators nodded quietly. The reference was both substantive and symbolic, a reminder that Crockett's stance was rooted not in ideology, but in established legal reasoning. As Crockett continued, the tone of the hearing began to change. She cited case outcomes, data, and bipartisan endorsements, dismantling the opposition's narrative piece by piece. McConnell's binder, once a weapon, now appeared more like a prop from a bygone political playbook. Observers would later describe this as the moment the hearing turned. What began as an attempt to frame Jasmine Crockett as a radical activist had become something very different, a demonstration of composure, preparation, and the quiet force of truth. By the time Crockett finished her opening statement, it was clear to everyone in the chamber, even to Mitch McConnell, that this would not be the straightforward takedown he had anticipated. Instead, it was the beginning of a confrontation that would reshape more than one political career. The tension in the Senate chamber was thick enough to feel. For a moment, silence filled the room after Representative Jasmine Crockett's calm but assertive introduction. Then, like a seasoned advocate before a jury, she began her counteroffensive, not with defiance, but with precision. The senator's report, Crockett said, references my criticism of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder as proof of my alleged bias. But let's look at what that decision actually did. Her voice was firm but not confrontational, each word deliberate. That ruling invalidated Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, removing the formula that determined which jurisdictions required federal pre-clearance before changing their voting laws. The result was predictable. Within months, states previously under pre-clearance began enacting new voting restrictions. Crockett paused, allowing the facts to settle in the air. My remarks, which the senator labeled radical, merely echoed the dissent of Justice Ginsburg, one of the most respected jurists in modern history. My position was not extreme. It was consistent with long-established civil rights principles. Around the chamber, heads nodded quietly. Senator Amy Klobuchar scribbled notes. Senator Cory Booker leaned forward, visibly engaged. On the Republican side, a few senators exchanged uneasy glances. McConnell sat still, his expression unreadable, but his fingers tapped faintly against the desk before him. Crockett turned another page in her binder. Next, she said, the report cites my litigation against the Dallas Police Department as evidence of anti-law enforcement sentiment. But what it omits, she continued, her tone sharpening slightly, is that the resulting consent decree reduced both civilian complaints and officer injuries by over 40% in the following 5 years. That's not hostility toward law enforcement, that's effective reform. Her statement was backed by data, by results, not ideology. A few moderate senators who had entered the hearing uncertain were now taking notice. Senator John Tester from Montana leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly, while Senator Kyrsten Sinema, seated 2 chairs away, began underlining portions of the notes before her. The cameras captured it all. C-SPAN's live feed showed a nominee refusing to play the traditional game of deflection. Instead, Crockett transformed the hearing into a real-time lesson in facts, law, and context. Her tone was composed, but beneath the surface lay years of experience, years spent in courtrooms where clarity and evidence mattered more than political theater. When she reached the section of McConnell's report labeling her rhetoric inflammatory, she met the accusation head-on. The senator quotes me as saying certain voting restrictions were designed to suppress minority voters. What his report omits, she said, her gaze steady, is that this exact phrase comes from a federal court decision, the court's words, not mine. That ruling was later upheld by a conservative appellate panel. A low murmur rippled across the chamber. The revelation landed with precision. By exposing the selective editing in McConnell's dossier, Crockett was doing more than defending herself. She was discrediting the very foundation of his attack. For a leader known for meticulous preparation, McConnell suddenly looked less in control than usual. Senator Durbin glanced toward McConnell before turning back to Crockett. "Representative Crockett," he said, "you may continue." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she replied. "I understand why some may find strong language uncomfortable. But civil rights law is not comfortable work. When courts find that discriminatory intent exists, the duty of a lawyer, any lawyer, is to name it plainly and seek remedy. That's not radicalism. That's the rule of law." Crockett's tone balanced restraint with conviction. She wasn't lecturing the senators, she was educating them, dismantling decades of political framing around civil rights enforcement. It was not about ideology, it was about fidelity to legal standards. She moved to the next section of the report, one titled Concerns Regarding Temperament. "The Senator's team has questioned my temperament for this role, citing my assertive conduct in several high-profile cases," she said. "To that, I offer this." She lifted another set of documents. Letters from opposing counsel in those very cases, including 3 Republican-appointed U.S. attorneys, attesting to my professionalism, integrity, and respect for the court. As she handed the letters to the committee clerk, the chamber fell silent again. Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins leaned forward, reviewing the documents as they were distributed. Even some of McConnell's Republican colleagues appeared taken aback by the gesture. These were not endorsements from political allies, but testimonials from legal adversaries. The effect was undeniable. Senator Dick Durbin, visibly impressed, leaned slightly toward his microphone. "Representative Crockett, for the record, these letters will be entered into the committee file." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she replied. McConnell adjusted his glasses, consulting notes passed to him by an aide. The rhythm of the hearing had slipped out of his control. For decades, his strategy relied on predictability. Nominees who played defense, who spoke carefully, who yielded ground in the face of accusation. But Crockett had rewritten the script. She was precise, factual, and unshakably calm. As she concluded her response, she looked directly at the committee. "For those who question whether my advocacy was too strong, I would ask, when I represented families denied housing under the Fair Housing Act, was I engaging in radical activism, or was I simply enforcing the law as written by Congress and upheld by the courts?" The question hung in the air. No one answered, but the silence itself was revealing. Even those who disagreed with her politically could not dispute her logic. For the next several minutes, she continued addressing specific points: her record on education equity, her partnerships with local police departments to implement de-escalation training, her work in coalition with faith leaders on community justice initiatives. Each example underscored a simple but powerful theme: her career had been defined not by ideology, but by measurable results. When she finally concluded, the hearing room felt transformed. The tension that had dominated McConnell's opening remarks had given way to quiet respect. Reporters in the back of the room whispered notes to one another, sensing they had just witnessed something rare, a hearing that would be studied for years to come. As cameras zoomed out, McConnell leaned toward his counsel, whispering something inaudible. His jaw was set, his demeanor still composed, but there was no mistaking the shift. The attack he had orchestrated for weeks was unraveling before the nation's eyes. Outside the hearing room, social media was already buzzing. Clips of Crockett calmly refuting McConnell's points spread across Twitter and news sites within minutes. Hashtags like #CrockettHearing and #FactsOverFrames began trending as journalists and legal analysts praised her poise. Inside, the chairman looked around. "We'll now move to questions," Durbin said. "Senator McConnell, you may begin." McConnell leaned into his microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." His tone was measured but colder now. He knew he had one chance left, to recover the momentum that had slipped away. Across from him, Crockett sat ready, hands folded, gaze unwavering. In the next phase of the hearing, the minority leader would press harder, testing her command of the law and her composure under pressure. What followed would turn a confirmation hearing into one of the most consequential exchanges in recent Senate history. The hearing resumed after a brief recess. The Senate chamber, once filled with chatter and flashes of cameras, had settled into an uneasy stillness. Outside, the headlines were already circulating: Crockett shifts momentum, McConnell faces pushback in judiciary showdown, calm in the eye of the storm. When the gavel struck, Senator McConnell leaned forward, clasping his hands over a stack of documents. His expression was cool, almost detached, but the veteran strategist inside him was recalculating. His decades in politics had taught him one rule: when control slips, reclaim it swiftly and surgically. Representative Crockett, he began, his voice steady but sharp at the edges, you've spoken eloquently about the law and your record. But let's be clear, some of your public statements go beyond the courtroom. They concern judgment and temperament, both vital for anyone entrusted with federal authority. So I'd like to revisit one in particular. He adjusted his glasses, scanning his notes. You once said, and I quote, "We are not dealing with ignorance in America, we are dealing with intention." Do you stand by that? Crockett didn't hesitate. I do, Senator, she said calmly, because history shows us that systemic inequities don't persist by accident. They persist through decisions, sometimes policy, sometimes neglect, but always choices. McConnell interjected. So you're suggesting intent, malicious intent, by lawmakers? No, Senator, she replied evenly. I'm suggesting awareness. When the impact of a policy disproportionately harms a protected group, and that pattern is documented again and again, continuing to ignore it becomes a choice. My statement was not about individuals, it was about accountability. The distinction was surgical. Even McConnell, a master of precision, couldn't easily counter it. But he wasn't done. He flipped to another tab in his binder, this one marked in red. You've also referred to certain legislative tactics as, let me find the quote, legalized obstruction against equality. Would you care to clarify that for this committee? Crockett nodded. Certainly. That quote was from a speech I gave to a group of law students at Howard University. I was describing the historical use of procedural tools, filibusters, voter ID laws, redistricting delays, that have often been used to slow or block civil rights advancements. I wasn't referring to this body specifically, Senator. I was referring to history. McConnell leaned back slightly, his lips tightening. History, he repeated. Yet here you are, seeking to shape the future. There was a pause, brief, but charged. Crockett smiled faintly. That's precisely why I'm here, Senator. A low murmur of reaction rippled through the room. McConnell didn't respond immediately. The cameras caught a flicker in his expression, not irritation, but recognition. He was facing someone who didn't just defend herself, she reframed the entire argument. Senator Durbin gestured. Please continue, Senator. McConnell leaned back in. You've mentioned collaboration with law enforcement and bipartisan initiatives. But your social media posts often tell a different story. For instance, your tweet from June 2020, "Justice delayed is justice denied," was accompanied by a call to dismantle oppressive systems. Would you call that balanced language? Crockett's eyes met his directly. Senator, that quote originates from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The phrase dismantle oppressive systems referred to unjust practices, not institutions as a whole. My work has always aimed to strengthen the justice system, not weaken it. Then, without raising her voice, she added, but I understand the discomfort that comes with reform. History teaches us that progress always feels disruptive to those who have benefited from the status quo. The air grew heavy again. Even the sound of camera shutters faded. McConnell exhaled through his nose, a sign of measured restraint, but the intensity of the exchange was undeniable. Senator Booker spoke next, his tone supportive but focused. Representative Crockett, could you speak to how you've balanced activism with impartiality in your legal career? Crockett turned slightly toward him. Yes, Senator. I've always believed that the law itself is neutral, but the people who apply it are not. My role has been to ensure that neutrality isn't lost to bias, whether racial, economic, or political. That's not activism, it's duty. A few senators nodded. Even Senator Collins took notes. McConnell, however, pressed once more, his voice tightening slightly. Representative, some critics have said your style is more suited to advocacy than to governance. That you thrive in confrontation, not consensus. What do you say to those critics? Crockett didn't flinch. I'd say they mistake conviction for confrontation, Senator. My work has always sought consensus, just not at the expense of truth. A moment of silence followed. The phrase hung in the air like a verdict. Not at the expense of truth. It was the kind of line that transcended the hearing. It would be quoted in headlines, in op-eds, and in classrooms. McConnell knew it. He closed his binder softly, realizing that pressing further risked amplifying her strength rather than exposing weakness. Instead, he shifted tactics. I appreciate your candor, he said, leaning back. Though I must say, your confidence borders on audacity. Crockett allowed herself a small smile. Senator, 4 generations, women like me weren't allowed in rooms like this. If it sounds like audacity, it's because we had to learn it just to be heard. The room erupted, not in applause, but in a collective exhale. Even some on the opposite aisle couldn't hide their reactions. The statement had cut through decorum and reached something deeper. Narrator, in that instant, the dynamic shifted. What began as an interrogation had transformed into an inflection point. Crockett's composure had become her weapon, and her intellect her defense. The committee wasn't just evaluating her qualifications anymore, they were witnessing a shift in political power itself. McConnell straightened his notes, signaling he was done. No further questions, he said, his tone flat but respectful. Durbin nodded. Thank you, Senator McConnell. Representative Crockett, we'll proceed with questions from the remaining members. As the next senator began, McConnell looked down briefly, a trace of thought behind his eyes. He had underestimated her, not her intelligence, but her ability to command the moment without force, without anger, and without apology. Outside the chamber, the headlines were already rewriting themselves in real time. Analysts described the hearing as a lesson in composure, a case study in rhetorical control, a generational clash handled with grace. Narrator, in politics, turning points rarely happen in an instant. But on that day, before millions watching live, the nation saw one unfold, quietly, unassumingly, through the steady voice of a woman who refused to bow to pressure. In the theater of power, calm had become revolution. The next phase of the hearing began under a changed atmosphere. The weight that had hung over the room earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, but stronger. Respect. Even among those who disagreed with Representative Jasmine Crockett's politics, there was no mistaking her command of the moment. Senator Dick Durbin, chairing the committee, adjusted his microphone. Representative Crockett, thank you for your responses so far, he said. We'll now move to questions from other members. The first to speak was Senator Lisa Murkowski, one of the chamber's more centrist voices. Her tone was measured but genuine. Representative, in your earlier testimony, you mentioned reform not as a form of rebellion, but as a form of faith, in the Constitution, in justice, in democracy itself. Can you expand on that? Crockett nodded thoughtfully. Yes, Senator. I believe reform is an act of belief. It's easy to criticize a system and walk away. But to stay in it, to fight to make it better, that takes faith. Faith in the idea that this country can still live up to its founding promises. Her words landed softly but firmly. Murkowski smiled faintly and said, "That's an answer I can respect." As the questioning moved across the dais, it became clear the tone had shifted entirely. Gone were the pointed interruptions and combative phrasing. Instead, senators were seeking insight, perhaps even inspiration. It wasn't typical for a confirmation hearing, and certainly not one that had started under such tension. Senator Cory Booker leaned forward, his voice carrying both warmth and intensity. Representative Crockett, I've watched you dismantle misinformation today with calm precision. What I want to ask is, how do you sustain that composure when so many come at you not with questions, but with judgment? A slight smile crossed her face. Senator, I've learned that composure isn't the absence of emotion, it's the mastery of it. I can't control what's said to me, but I can control whether I give power to chaos. And I've found that truth has its own gravity, it doesn't need to shout to be heard. Booker nodded slowly, visibly moved. That's something our whole country could stand to hear right now. The camera panned to the gallery, where reporters were scribbling notes furiously. Outside the hearing room, analysts on live broadcasts echoed similar sentiments. One CNN commentator remarked, Crockett isn't just defending herself, she's redefining what political grace looks like in an era of spectacle. Back in the chamber, Senator Josh Hawley adjusted his tie, preparing to reclaim some footing for the opposition. Representative Crockett, he began, you've spoken about reform, but some critics say your rhetoric contributes to division rather than unity. Do you see any responsibility for the tone of discourse in our politics today? Crockett met his gaze. I do, Senator. And I also believe responsibility must be shared. Division doesn't come from disagreement, it comes from dishonesty. My goal has never been to silence opposition, but to expose contradiction. Unity can't be built on illusion, it must be built on truth. Hawley hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. It wasn't agreement, but acknowledgement. Even he couldn't deny the poise behind her words. Narrator, in the span of an hour, a hearing that began as a partisan battlefield had become something else entirely, a civics lesson unfolding in real time. The cameras didn't just capture argument, they captured transformation. Next came Senator Amy Klobuchar. Representative, your career has included both litigation and legislative work. You've been an advocate, but also a policymaker. How do you balance those roles? Crockett leaned slightly forward. By remembering that law without empathy becomes tyranny, and empathy without structure becomes chaos. The best leaders understand both, how to feel and how to govern. Klobuchar nodded, writing something in her notes. Behind her, a few staffers exchanged quick glances, the kind people share when they sense they're witnessing a line that will echo for years. Durbin then turned to the next senator. Senator Graham, you have the floor. Lindsey Graham's tone was cautious. He'd watched the earlier exchanges carefully and understood that aggression would backfire. Representative, you've certainly made an impression today. I'll just ask this, if confirmed, how will you ensure that your passion doesn't cloud your judgment? Crockett's response came without hesitation. Senator, passion is what drives judgment toward purpose. Without it, power becomes hollow. But passion must always bow to principle, and mine always has. Her delivery was firm, not defensive. Graham gave a half smile, then leaned back. Fair enough, he said quietly. Narrator, in that moment, something rare happened, a truce of respect between ideological opposites. Not agreement, but understanding. The questioning continued for another hour, with senators from both sides probing different aspects of Crockett's record. Her work on education equity, her efforts to expand mental health support in underserved communities, her collaboration with business leaders on fair employment initiatives. Each answer reinforced the same pattern: evidence, balance, and clarity. As the final question wrapped, Durbin looked around the room. Are there any further questions for the nominee? Silence. Then, hearing none, we'll move to closing remarks. McConnell, who had remained quiet since his exchange with Crockett, requested the floor. The room tensed slightly, everyone waiting to see how he would respond after hours of shifting momentum. He cleared his throat. Mr. Chairman, I'll just say this. Representative Crockett has shown today that she is a capable and articulate advocate for her views. While I continue to have concerns about her interpretive approach to the law, I can at least acknowledge that she's presented her case with clarity and dignity. It wasn't an endorsement, but it was an acknowledgement, and from Mitch McConnell, that carried weight. The cameras caught Crockett's polite nod in response. Thank you, Senator, she said. I appreciate your words. Narrator, it wasn't victory or concession, it was equilibrium. And in Washington, that is its own form of triumph. Durbin closed his folder. Thank you, Representative Crockett. This committee will reconvene next week for the vote. The gavel fell. The hearing was adjourned. Reporters rushed to the hallways as Crockett exited, surrounded by cameras, questions flying from every direction. But she didn't linger for spectacle. She paused only once, to greet a group of law students standing in the hallway, watching wide-eyed. Keep studying, she told them with a smile. The law's only as strong as the people who believe in it. Narrator, as the cameras followed her out, it was clear that something larger than a hearing had taken place. It was a shift in tone, in balance, in expectation. A reminder that power isn't just in the loudest voice, but in the calmest truth. Outside the marble steps of the Senate, the autumn air felt heavier than usual. Reporters swarmed, cameras buzzed, and social media feeds were on fire. Overnight, Representative Jasmine Crockett had gone from a nominee under siege to a national figure symbolizing a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in volume, but in conviction. Narrator: it was more than a hearing. It was a recalibration, a moment where the nation paused to consider what strength really looks like. The morning after, every major network carried highlights. CNN called her testimony a masterclass in composure. The Washington Post described it as a historic shift in tone for congressional hearings. Even conservative outlets, while critical of her policy positions, acknowledged her poise. One headline read, "Crockett holds her ground without raising her voice." At Howard University, law students gathered in a lecture hall, watching clips of the hearing projected on the wall. One student whispered, "That's what professionalism under pressure looks like." Another replied, "That's what history looks like when it changes its mind." Meanwhile, political analysts debated the long-term implications. Was this just a skilled performance, or a genuine turning point in American political discourse? Narrator: in a landscape often dominated by outrage, Crockett's silence between sentences spoke louder than any confrontation. Her restraint didn't signify weakness, it revealed control. And in that control, she found power. Over the following days, interviews flooded in. Morning shows invited her to speak, but Crockett declined most appearances. "Let the record speak for itself," she told her staff. Her decision not to capitalize on the viral attention only amplified respect. For many, it was a rare display of humility in a time when every moment seemed curated for headlines. Within the Senate, something subtle began to shift. Aides described the next Judiciary Committee session as markedly calmer. One staffer told reporters, after Crockett's hearing, there was this unspoken understanding: tone matters again. Narrator: it wasn't that politics had changed overnight, but a precedent had been set. A reminder that integrity, when paired with intellect, could still cut through the noise. In the weeks that followed, letters of support poured into her office, from civil rights organizations, law professors, and ordinary citizens. Many shared stories of how her words resonated with them. A teacher from Atlanta wrote that she used Crockett's testimony to teach her students about courage. A retired judge from Illinois wrote that her response to McConnell restored faith in the decorum of debate. But not everyone was pleased. Some critics accused her of calculated performance, claiming her composure was rehearsed. Others dismissed her as another polished partisan. Crockett, as always, didn't respond publicly. Instead, she returned to work, meeting with constituents and continuing her advocacy for judicial fairness and transparency. Narrator: that was the quiet truth of Jasmine Crockett's legacy. She never chased the echo. She spoke once, clearly, and let the truth travel on its own. Then came the vote. The chamber was silent as the roll was called. The tally unfolded slowly, one name after another. When the final count was announced, the result was closer than expected, confirmed by a narrow but decisive margin. Gasps, murmurs, and a few scattered smiles followed. Crockett exhaled, her expression calm, her hands folded as the gavel fell. Narrator: she had done what few thought possible, not by overpowering her critics, but by outlasting them with grace. That evening, she addressed a small crowd outside the Capitol. No teleprompters, no grand staging. Just a single podium under the dim glow of the city lights. "Today's vote wasn't about me," she began. "It was about what happens when we remember that integrity isn't outdated, it's undefeated. Power doesn't have to shout. Justice doesn't have to rush. The truth just has to stand long enough to be seen." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. She continued, "In every courtroom, in every classroom, in every corner of this country, there are people trying to do the right thing quietly. I want them to know, quiet doesn't mean invisible. Sometimes, it's the stillness before the change." Applause filled the air, not thunderous, but sustained, genuine, the kind that lingers. Narrator: her words that night echoed far beyond the steps of the Capitol. They found their way into classrooms, into conversations, into the nation's conscience. And for a brief moment, America remembered that civility and strength are not opposites, they are companions. In the following months, Crockett's confirmation became a case study at law schools and journalism programs alike. Analysts replayed her exchanges with McConnell frame by frame, dissecting the anatomy of her restraint. Professors pointed out how her tone shifted the energy of the room, how clarity disarmed aggression, how fact replaced spectacle. A year later, a journalist asked her what she remembered most about that day. She smiled softly and said, "The silence after my final answer." That's when I knew I didn't just speak, I was heard. Narrator. In an era where noise often masquerades as leadership, Jasmine Crockett reminded the nation of something ancient and profound, that truth, spoken with calm conviction, carries its own thunder. The closing shot, Crockett walking through the Capitol corridors, the camera following from behind. Her steps are slow, deliberate, steady. She doesn't look back. Fade to black. Text on screen. Integrity is not loud. It is lasting. Jasmine Crockett.